Like, what am I?
Hello, this is Mad Cat, and I'm not the angry egalitarian today, but just a book nerd that really loves RPG systems, stories, and characters. Today I'm joined with Catrece and Fatherless, both avid fans of RPGs and character building, as well as world building, and I'm going to turn it over to Cat to start us off.
Hey, so apparently, we were last on the topic of. Actually, I don't remember what our last topic was, so I suppose we should probably just start off with character design in general, and then we should probably move into like the world building and how that affects characters and what makes them who they are. So, to start off, let's begin with what makes a character instead of just an avatar? Like, what makes them specifically, they have their own personality, that kind of thing.
Well, I think what really starts it off with people, why do people connect with the villain like Loki? Why are they disconnected from a Mary Sue character? And it's what is their flaw? Because the one thing we can all relate to one another, even if it's vastly different from one another, is the flaws that we have. Are we gamblers? Are we alcoholics? Are we quick to anger? Are we passive aggressive? And I think that's the defining trait of a good character is how weak are they?
I can agree with that. I would say that without flaws, you certainly don't have a personality at all. Like, you have to have something that, if we were all exactly perfect, if we were without flaw at all, then we'd all be carbon copies of exactly the same thing. It's those little nuanced errors that basically define us as who we really are as an individual. And if you have an avatar instead of a character, one of the defining traits of an avatar is they don't have flaws. And that's part of what makes them not really a character in the first place.
I think with the real one of the things that makes this real critical is the mechanical way that your flaws and background traits are affected or come into play, you know. And I think that that kind of connection is as important, as the background itself, because you can have a very fleshed out background and really know, be able to explain to yourself like what the character's all about. But if you don't have kind of actionable mechanics for bringing those things out during play, particularly with flaws, I feel, then it's kind of all at a loss,
Well, and this is why my approach to when I design characters, and I developed this when I was doing Star Wars: The Old Republic. I was in charge of role play for my guild. And God, did I see so many Anakin Skywalkers, honestly. It was like almost always the same thing. Like, from a very young age, they were more powerful than their masters, and their parents died in some horrible crash, and they graduated from the order before anyone else. And it's just like, oh my God, this is so boring. And so when I started talking to people about how to design their characters to make them more realistic, I'm like, start with a negative trait. It doesn't have to be that many. Just have one. What's one negative thing about your character? And it's a good starting point because how they deal with that characterization, are they a gambler? Are they mean? All of these things, the rest of their traits will be partially based on how they handle this negative aspect. Do they ignore it? Are they not aware of it? You know, so that's why negative traits is always so important for me when I design a character.
Well, the thing about a negative trait, oddly enough, is that it doesn't necessarily have to remain a negative. Like how you express something that's typically bad can actually be shed in a good light at times. So let's say you have somebody who's, well, I don't know, they're quick to anger, but let's say they're in a situation where being very easily upset and utilizing that, let's say they're a berserker character, sort of like a barbarian, and they do like their raging and stuff. That can actually be very beneficial in some situations. It depends on how they use it and when they use it, and the context within such. So even like a manipulative, horrible character, if you need a spy, that's kind of a handy trait to have. So even those bad traits can be put into effective use, and a lot of people, like just people, not even characters, but people learn that they have a certain trait, a certain mindset, something about them that they prefer handling problems in a very particular manner. And because of those traits, that's what defines how they build their entire life. If you have somebody who happens to be manipulative, then maybe they want to go into law as a lawyer so that they can use that in a beneficial manner for society instead of winding up as a con artist, because both of those are valid options which use very similar skills in some ways.
Well, a good example of that with the character I had, and this was going back to Star Wars: The Old Republic. My character Drysus, he was basically a war orphan. His family died on some planet. He's not really sure which side was responsible, but it left him emotionally distant. And he has no real emotions. He doesn't express himself at all. He just seems like dead to the world. And when the Jedi found him, they thought that he would be perfect. He was force sensitive, but they thought he would be perfect. He would be like the ultimate example of what it means to be a Jedi. Because he has no emotions. He doesn't express himself. And instead of getting the mental help that he needed as a child, he was exploited for that reason. And even as an adult, he's still very much like that. And it's not really a good thing, but it certainly makes sense why someone might find value in that.
Well, good is a very vague and fluid term. Like, what is a good thing? What is a bad thing? What is, like, that particular example? Well, being fairly logical and not, like, running through highly emotional situations. It's like, well, maybe you really would end up being a good Jedi. The thing is that worth the negative aspects that are tied into that as well, because it's a trade-off. Like, it's not just all good or all bad. There's always a blending between the two. Things that we consider to be negative traits, they usually originate in beneficial aspects that have been drawn to an excessive degree so that instead of being healthy, it becomes unhealthy. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not useful at the same time.
Mr. Vice Guy.
It's
a trope of a person who has a vice that ends up being positive.
I love double-edged sword kind of personality quirks,
For example?
Well, like Wolverine, he's a one-man army. Like he's really good at handling situations by himself, and he's also absolutely horrible at doing anything other than handling situations by himself.
Yeah, he doesn't do the teamwork thing so well, which is kind of a limitation when you're part of a team.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I guess I'm gonna sound like the Fate RPG friggin' ambassador, and I'm not trying to be. It's just that I've been reading on it lately, and it's kind of captured part of my imagination. But when you start the game, the biggest part of character creation is coming up with 5 aspects for your character, and to whatever degree you can, you want to make them double-edged. And the purpose of that is your aspects don't just give you like a static bonus or penalty to certain things in the game, but you actually can invoke them at certain times um, to get a bonus in a certain situation if it sort of makes sense to the narrative. But you can also the game master can compel them, or you can ask for a compel, and what basically happens is uh, it actually turns out into either a negative or a that's the thing, either a negative or like a story complication that sort of just pops out of nowhere or pops out of an element of your background. And when you're compelled in that way, they have an economy of what they call fate points. And the real game just revolves around fate points. And you basically allow your story or your character's life to get more complicated and more difficult, and then you get fate points, and then you can spend fate points to sort of work your way out of trouble. And it's a very simple system, but it's very elegant in that, you know. Um, and that's why you try to have your aspects be as double-edged. You want a few of your aspects to be double-edged. Because you could just do something as simple as like, like kleptomaniac, or like famed kleptomaniac, and on one hand it would mean that people would always be coming to you for opportunities for heists. But on the other hand, it would mean that maybe you sometimes lose control and steal something at a really inopportune time, you know. And you actually will kind of work out an arrangement or a negotiation with the game master for when things kind of go bad for your character and just the story takes a weird twist. Also, by
Well,
the way, I think it'd be hilarious to do a MRA Fate game set in Toronto, like urban Toronto. It'd be hilarious, but that's a whole other thing.
well, I'm showing the Fate website that you told us about earlier.
Yeah, yeah,
I'm trying
and
to look for more information on it, but I'm not really seeing anything that tells me what the system is. Just a lot of.
yeah. Well, let me. It's Fate Core is what you want. Go to Fate Core there on the top left, a little bit. See if you can click on that.
What are you talking about? Oh, right here. Okay.
Yeah, and then you can actually get the game for free. It's like the $5 suggested donation. See, see if you can scroll down. Yeah, you can do the. Yeah, so it's pay what you like, so you don't actually have to pay. Though there's another place on the website where you can download it also for free as well. Um,
Well, and I'm curious what this system looks like because, like with some of the other RPGs I've played, it's really just a focus on, okay, here's your character, this is the weapon they have, these are the things they can roll for, go. And it's like, okay, I need more than that. And D&D, back in the day, that's what it really was like. I played second edition, and it just was like, that's what my DM did for me. But even with the newer edition, it's like, well, you can have a couple of background stuff. That might help a little bit. But I always go back to MechWarrior 3rd Edition, which has so far been the best system I've ever seen. Although, to be
yeah,
fair, I haven't seen Cat's system just yet, but
yeah. Well,
it's
Fate.
like you roll for a path. Now, you don't have to do that. You can just go ahead and create a character all you want, but it does concern itself with good traits, bad traits, a wide range of skills, and that while the skills are a little bit specific to what branch you go with, it's not so linear. You can have poison resistance even if you never wind up in a situation where that's going to be an issue. Or you could be an alcoholic. there's a lot of chance for unique characters within the system itself. And as Dean was saying, I mean, D&D 5th edition does allow you to pretty much design whatever you want to what your imagination is. But the problem I have with D&D is it doesn't directly translate into your interaction with your skill system.
Yeah, that's the thing.
My character lived off plants from the age of 5 to 10. I think he might know a few things about plants, but I can't put that as a skill.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean that's the thing with D&D is that the backgrounds can be whatever you want, and it's because it's just tacked on there, and it doesn't really come into focus during gameplay unless you just sort of say that it's there, But it's not supported by the system, very much, not in a significant way.
I found with D&D, there's basically the issue that it's like Fatherless is saying, that it's like, well, you can put it in there, but the mechanical aspect of the game and the role-playing aspect of the game are held at arm's length from each other. They don't really impact one another. They do touch a little bit.
They don't touch.
There is a little bit of a touch there. Like, there's a little overlap in 5th edition, but it's not very significant. It's
more like flavor. It's more like flavor on top of something, rather than being like this.
It's not a core aspect, but that's not what D&D is really meant to be. Like, for all the people who vehemently defend that, well, D&D is all about your characters. It can be all about your characters, and it's like, yeah, but not according to the rules. It's not built into the rules. It's something that you can do with house rules. Yeah. It's something that you can make up yourself. It's something that your GM can run, but there's nothing built into the game that really emphasizes that. It's not part of the game. Oh, I forget what his name was.
It's like the differences between Mech Warrior and Battletech. Battletech, you could technically get out of your mech, but the rules in the system wasn't designed for roleplay. It was designed for combat. So when you got Mech Warrior, that was designed to, like, who is your character?
Yeah.
That's how...
It's a big difference. It's a very big difference.
And maybe there should be a D&D edition that comes out that asks a little bit more about who your character is. Hey, if you want to play D&D and just have combat, go at it, Kudos to you, but if you want to explore a little bit more about who your character is, let's have a system that's designed around that concept.
Yeah, and I think what would be more satisfying to me is it's not just the things that your character is good at that come from your background, but also the things that kind of randomly happen to you also are informed by your background too.
Oh yeah.
Like your past, it's not, because sometimes I feel like when it's bad, there's like this dividing line. There's your background, and then there's like what actual play now. And there's this, and even if the DM writes stuff into the current campaign, the two, I just feel like you don't get the continuity between the two, And I think it would be fun if your background was just this thing that's opening up possibilities for play in terms of what the game world does to your character.
Actually, I had to take a moment to look up the name because I'm terrible with names. Adam Coble, which I probably mispronounced, one of the guys responsible for making the game system Dungeon World, had a very interesting take on it. He basically said flat out that if your game does not have a mechanic that actually alters gameplay, then your game has nothing to do with whatever that is. So, like, if you have a game that has no mechanics that actually alter your ability to roleplay, then your game is not about role-playing.
And that's kind of what my first look at Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition was like, is this was more about, okay, you're now in this situation, what do you do? Okay, well, I attack. Well, or I want to speak out to the person. Well, no, you can't do that. You have to attack. And it's like, so what's the role play aspect here?
It's not. I mean, if 5th edition is basically it's designed to be run as a railroad. It's just, here's a scenario, you can do some role playing. It doesn't really matter what you say. It's just flavor to show what your character's like when they're not fighting, and then you're fighting, and then back and forth with the occasional skill challenge. But the role playing doesn't do much other than just show people what your character is.
And I definitely see the appeal of just being in combat and having to decide tactics and trying to solve puzzles, and that's all well and fine, but I really need a story. It's hard for me to play a mindless shooter game on the computer. I have to have some story in order to keep me involved, and that's the way I've always been, and that's why MMORPGs that had a rich story to it always attracted me. I mean, I gave up playing World of Warcraft because I really didn't feel a good story from level 1 to 16. That's how far I got. Because I didn't feel included into the story. I felt it was just a loose association of, oh, now you're a part of this story and part of that story. And at the time, I was playing Matrix Online, and I felt more a part of the world, more a part of the story.
Yeah, and it's really funny because story can mean so many different things. And for example, as much as I enjoy combat, I really enjoy the sense of exploration more than anything else. And I don't really care if the narrated plot is particularly interesting, but I do like to sort of see the world expand and see kind of what's in it and how things kind of work. But I don't really give a shit. But if the story, the plot, the motivating force is sort of this hair-thin trope, I don't really care. I feel like Divinity Original Sin is a little bit like that. The plot's almost is pretty trite in a way, and you just kind of follow it. There's all sorts of funny side quests, but the exploring the world and watching the world get bigger is kind of cool in that game. And the combat's really fun in that game.
I'm a very big person when it comes to exploration. I spend a portion of my time playing any game just trying to say, can I go over here? What's over here? And it annoys some people I play games with. It's just go back to the main story, go back to the mission. And it's no, I want to see what's over here. Maybe there's some secret. Maybe there's something. And most of the time it's nothing, but I just can't help but explore. When I played Dungeons & Dragons online, one of the things that I did, because I was a free player, so there wasn't a whole lot I could do, I would jump on buildings all the time just to see if I could get a little bit higher. And I actually got pretty high up on the buildings, too. Or when I was playing Rift, I did the same thing. I explored the tallest mountain. I actually did find a secret that way. Exploration is very important to me as well as story.
And yeah, and I feel that the combat, I don't really give a shit about winning, but I do enjoy exploring the combat system. I don't know if I care about having the most badass team as possible, but it kind of exploring how the system gives you options and sort of things feel, how the combat system responds, makes certain types of choices. Is a thing unto itself. But that's sort of like a weird little world to live in,
Let me make this quick point, Kat. Sure. One of my favorite first-person shooter games to play was the Battlefield series, specifically Battlefield 2, because I suck at first-person shooters, but I'm a good support guy. I can be an engineer, I can be a sniper, I could just, go on to the flag when no one's around and capture it real quickly and then move away. I felt like I had a lot more options than going around and shooting people, and that's the kind of player I am. Go ahead, Cap.
Okay. What I was going to say is that you're basically looking at differences in player types. Each individual has different things that they find fun. You can largely group those kinds of things together, though. Like, for example, interest in exploration, interest in trying to figure out how the combat mechanics work, things like going into combat and just fighting and winning. People that are interested in the lore and the background information. Maybe they're interested in uh, figuring out puzzles or learning or talking to the NPCs and such. Each of these things is a different thing that various players will prefer to use. If they don't get that, then they're not going to have fun. The thing is, no one system can cater to everything. It's not possible. It's you half-ass all of them to try to do so. And as such, every game has to be specialized in having a target audience, what it's trying to accomplish, and actually focuses on doing what it's good at. You can usually have, say, 2 to 4 things that you're focused on that you're doing really well, especially if they happen to all be sort of synergetic with each other. Like if you have like a strong lore building, then you probably are okay with lots of exploration because the two kind of go hand in hand a lot of the time. So the idea is that you want your games to be built in such a way that it doesn't try to do everything. It picks its target audience and it caters to them and does it makes a game that's good for what they are looking for. And I find that if you try to look at it from like an individual perspective of I'm going to make the game that's good for me only, or it's good for me and my friends, then while that may be very effective for that very niche group, you're not going to find that exact lineup of group in very many situations. So you want to be a little bit more broad, but you also want to be focused kind of thing.
It really does come down to marketing in the end. When it comes to game design, book design, RPG design, it's comes as there's the element of fun, but then there's the element of marketing. And it's funny how people avoid marketing like the plague. I mean, it's not fun, but it's something you have to do. You have to be aware of what people really want in something. But the thing is that even AAA game titles fail at this. You know, game makers of all varieties fail at this. They don't really have an understanding of what people want. They're not willing to go out there and ask. And part of the problem is that they look at, okay, what is sold in the past? Oh, well, you know, World of Warcraft sold, so let's make a game like World of Warcraft. Well, you know, other games sold as well, like Anarchy Online, EverQuest, to name a few. But these systems are never looked at as much as World of Warcraft because World of Warcraft was the most successful. So instead of like saying, okay, what was good about all of these games that people love, they are like, let's make a clone. And it's very easy to fall into that trap. So either you're only designing a game that you would play, or you're designing the game that the lowest common denominator will play.
Yeah, I feel that way about Hans Zimmer sometimes as a composer, which is weird because it's sort of like people. There's too many people that he's like their favorite composer, and I don't just mean other composers, but you know, if you're doing music for a game or whatever, people will just oh, I love Hans Zimmer, do that Hans Zimmer thing, and it's like, what does that
You
even
need to speak
mean?
up.
Oh, sorry.
It's all right.
Yeah, so you know, you might be working on something, and then people will be like, "Give me that, you know, that Hans Zimmer sound," and it's like, what does that even mean? Because he sounds so different depending on the project that he's doing. But yeah, I mean, when everybody just all imitates one person, it gets really bland really fast.
And unfortunately, they don't pick and choose aspects that work for what they're trying to accomplish. I find this like I'm looking at so much research because I'm working on like a role-playing game, and I'm looking at like so many people before me, they've just blindly followed what has come before them. They've said, okay, well, D&D did this, so I'm going to do the exact same thing. And it's like, that's because D&D is working at a very specific goal that they're trying to aim for. They're basically making a tabletop war game with a single character that has some story put into it. And their mechanics are designed in such a way that it works for that goal. But then you have other people that it's like, I'm gonna make like a really story heavy game, but I'm gonna use like D&D's mechanics. And it's like the mechanics aren't gonna work with that because it's a different goal. It's not compatible. You're trying to use mechanics without understanding what the purpose of the mechanics are. So you can't just clone like World of Warcraft. You have to see what is my target audience, and my target audience doesn't 100% want everything that D&D not D&D, but World of Warcraft offers. So why am I not looking to something like, say, Arcage that you mentioned, or other ones like WildStar? It just went free to play, for example, stuff like that. It's like you have to kind of pick and choose which aspects work together, look at what they did that worked, understand why it worked, and then see how you can convert that concept into a way that it can actually benefit your presentation, your goals. If you're just going to drop stuff in that has no purpose for what you're trying to accomplish, why do you think you're going to accomplish anything?
And to take Star Wars, for example, I mean, it messed up on a lot of things, and I blame EA for this, not BioWare, even though they're now technically the same company, but they took a chance on a system that was very successful for their single-player game, but has never been done for an MMO before. They took the basically it was a life path system. You had missions, but it was a part of such a larger story that you went from one story segment to the next, but it was all fits together. And I used it as a way to determine how light-sided or dark-sided my character was. And my main character, Grysus, he was exactly in middle, but I got the choice to decide. Some choices were light side, some choices were dark side, and I could definitely role play my character. And I've never seen another game attempt to do that. Yeah, sometimes you get other options, for dialogue, but it never really had consequence. It never had anything that just was like all encompassing of your character. And they took a chance with this, even though it never was done before. If it was done in a very limited way. World of Warcraft never had a system like that. Sometimes you have to take a chance and say, you know what, I want to do something different. You have to really work your ass off to make it balanced and all of that, but you can't do the same thing that other people have done. You can borrow ideas and say, how can I make this better?
Well, yeah, it's like you can't carbon copy things one for one. Especially since, well, why would they buy your product instead of somebody else's that already did that and they probably did it better? But the thing is, like, it's the concept of inspiration. Ideas do not exist in a vacuum. You take somebody else's concept and you say, okay, they did this in a certain way. They had this goal. I have a similar goal, so therefore I want something similar to what they had. However, because I have a different setup of the variety of goals that I have to do something different than they did. Like, just transferring it over one for one is not going to work. Like, I can't, like, for example, for my system, I can't use the exact same life path system that you see in, like, the Mech Warriors game, or actually a couple others since then. It won't work because the species for my player characters are just so remarkably varied in, like, their lifespans and stuff. Like, I have one species that probably doesn't live more than 3 to 5 years, and I have another that living a couple hundred is not unrealistic. Having things split up by one of the life path systems that I was researching, they split it up by, well, there's so many years worth of experience doing this, and it's like, this is not going to be balanced. It's going to be completely broken. So I couldn't use that exact same mechanic because it would not work for how I have things set up. But I can take some concepts from it and work them in such a way that the basic concept and the goal that it's aiming towards can both be used without carbon copying what came before.
Well, I want to shift the focus of the conversation now to something that's, I know at least is very important to me and Kat, and I'm sure it's important for you, Fatherless, but it's the concept of world building. And my experience as a writer is this is something that is largely ignored by the writing community. No one really gives a shit about it. You know, when it comes to map making or deciding what the world is about. And that's why I dedicate my website now to world building and trying to tell people here's all the possible things that you can have. But probably one of the most ignored aspects when it comes to designing a world is the economy. You know, one gold piece to pay for a horse and a bowl of soup. There's no economic structure that could survive like that. And I definitely see it in video games where they try to do the simple gold, silver, and copper economy system. There's only been a very few societies that ever actually survived like that. Most of the time, they just relied on a single coin. But, and I'm sure Kat's going to hit the ground running with world building conversation. But in role-playing games, for you, Fatherless, you're saying that you're wanting to design one that's probably going to be based similar to Fate system. And Kat, what you're doing in your interaction with other people, do you feel that world building is still very important? And how is it treated?
Okay, I find it ungodly important, of course, that some people might assume I'm saying that just because I am a world design specialist, that it's like, out of all the things that I work on, like the mechanics and the story, the narrative, all the different things, the world design is the part that I specialize in. But I do so because it's the single most important part of any project. Like, what I would describe world design as, just so that we have a definition so that people know what we're talking about, is world design is it's a form of pre-production. When you go into making like a movie or a book or a TV show or a game or anything else, it doesn't matter. You have your pre-production, production, your post-production. Your pre-production, if you invest the time and energy into it, it makes everything else that comes after it higher quality, faster, and cheaper to produce. If you know who you're going to hire, if you know what the sets are, if you know like the outline of the story, if you know what kind of special effects shots you're going to need to use, if you start planning these out before you even start shooting the camera, like start casting crew members before you start building a wardrobe or anything like that. If you know what you're going to do before you do it, you can make everything so much vastly more efficient. World design is all about everything that goes into things like the technology. For example, let's use Star Wars for an example. Lightsabers, they're part of world design. Using like skimmers, like your walkers, all of the different armor, your blasters, all of that technology, that's part of world design. Having things like looking at planet Tatooine, say it has moisture farmers because they need that moisture. They need water on a desert planet. Without water, there can be no life. So, having a very large portion of their economy centered around water, if you don't have that, you don't have much of a civilization in general. So, stuff like that is what lays the foundation for everything else. If you want to have a character, it's like Luke came from a family of moisture farmers because that's what he needed to do. And because they needed the help on the farm, he wasn't able to go off to the academy. And that kind of thing is exactly what builds the world, and it's what makes it possible for this story to exist at all.
I'd like to add something to that.
Sure.
A mistake that I saw with a writer. First off, Star Wars has some of the worst world building I've ever seen. At least the prequel movies did. But I had a friend who was writing a story, and it took place in like this castle with the town built around it, or a village rather. And her characters were talking in the throne room, and then started walking, and within a few seconds they were at the stables. And I asked her, how big is your city? And she's like, I don't know. It's like, well, how far away is it to go from the throne room to the stables? I don't know. Wouldn't that make sense to know that? Do you think you could really walk 2 minutes away from the throne room and be in the stables? And that is definitely a part of world building. Being able to design a map, being able to place out where things are. Because there's no castle in the world that you could be in the most important room of the castle and then be in one of the least important places in the entire city within 2 minutes.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's tough, man, because that's why I'm not a writer, because there's a whole aspect of writing that requires that kind of thinking. That's really, I don't think I could ever do my homework in that way. One thing I wanted to add about world building is about a year and a half ago I kind of got this bug, and I wanted to go ahead and try to come up with it. By the way, Fate is background neutral, so there would be no, so it gives me no information on what I want to do for a setting. Um, Anyway, but about a year and a half ago, I got this bug that I wanted to really nail down the setting for the game that I work on and off, because I'm just a hobbyist with the RPG thing. Um, and um, it's really funny because if you Google, or at least a year and a half ago, if you Googled world building tips, almost, I would say 9 out of 10 pages you land on start with an overworld map. And the more I think about it, the worse I think that is as a starting place. Like, unless geography is really the interesting thing about your world, I think that's a terrible place to begin. You know, and it just seems to me that like you should start with the stuff that's interesting and go from there. And if it's technology, and you're going to try to work out, what bits of technology are unique and interesting in this world, that's great. Or if it's, if it is economics or whatever. But like, I mean, I feel like if you have an economic system that somewhat kind of sort of resembles like what we already have now, that probably wouldn't be very interesting. But if you had like an economic system where the currency of trade was information, and you just people traded information, massive like, super gigabits of information in some futuristic like post currency world, that would be that, and it wasn't like a as linear as our economic system. That'd be cool. Or on the other state sign, if it was really like an actual bartering system and it was just hard to trade stuff because no one really wanted to part what they had, you know then that would be something where you would focus on economics. But I feel like if you just try to give like equal attention to everything, then you pay a lot of attention to things that were never going to be interesting anyway, and kind of ignore the things that might have been unique or special about your game. If it's a magic system, or if it's something to do with racial groups, or maybe the geography is weird. I mean, maybe when you draw your overworld hex map, there's no mountains, there's no plains, and there's no oceans. It's just like weird fractal space here, and like stardust that people can walk around in for some reason here, and inky blackness here. Like, and you have to explain how that all works.
I know
If that
Kat
makes any
wants to
sense.
respond, but I'm going to jump before she does because she talks a lot. Here's the kicker. I actually agree with you 100%. And saying that, my world building website, the first thing I started with was geography, but I was also doing map making for those who can't draw. But I actually agree with you that if you're going to start anywhere with world building, you need to start with economy. You need to start with how does people in this world make money? What resources do they have access to? What technologies do they have access to? What kind of rule of government is there? And all of these different things add to the economic situation of a story. I had, the same friend, she said that she wanted to, this world, which was medieval-esque, invested in preserves. They could make preserved food. And the thing that they preserved the most was grapefruit. They made a grapefruit jam, and it was all special. And I'm like, that would have a profound impact on society. You're talking about developing a preserving system, which really wasn't available back then. But more than that, I mean, you could prevent scurvy on ships. You could pack preserves of food that wouldn't spoil. And she was basing it on, well, it's so easy to do nowadays. She didn't take into consideration that it would have been hard for them to just develop that technology or to do it in mass. So, and she didn't even think about how that would really change society. If you're going to start with a resource like that, then there's no reason you can't say that this civilization can create preserves, but you got to think about how does that affect everything, the people, the government, the economy. But I will say, though, that geographic world building is still important. And maybe it doesn't make it into your story. Maybe it doesn't make it into your game, but there's a lot of problems that I see with geographic world building. Probably the biggest one is rivers. Rivers flowing uphill. Rivers can't do that. They always flow down.
Yeah.
Or rivers splitting off in two different directions. That can happen, but it's extremely rare and a very temporary situation.
Yeah.
Rivers don't break off suddenly. Two rivers can merge together, and it's like, or another one that I found is that people write about characters running in a forest. A true forest you can't really run through, at least not at full speed, or ride a horse through, unless you're already on a path. But it's these little things that you need to keep in the back of your mind when you're working on your project.
For sure, yeah. I think I would sort of.
Mike?
Oh, sorry. I feel that the order that you answer those questions is going to have a big impact on what you end up with as a final result. I mean, and this is why I think that starting with geography first as a matter of course, without that being a conscious decision, I think it kind of handicaps people. And I don't know. The other thing too, and this is sort of a lesser question, is your world actually internally consistent? I mean, we sort of assume it is, but like, to me, you might just say that here's a couple of things about this world that don't actually make sense. I guess it depends on what you're trying to end up with when you're done with your world building. Like, are you trying to like end up with a world that's internally consistent and almost runs like a little simulation, and you can just kind of set it up and it runs, or you have a sense of how everything works, or are you sort of kind of coming up with connected but not necessarily like completely understood sort of little objects that you can interact with, that you can sort of take out and play with when you're playing your RPG, but they're not necessarily intended to be used as a complete simulation, because it kind of comes down, it kind of comes back to like, what are the mechanics of the game, when you frame a scene, when you're playing, what informs what is in that scene, because if that comes from a simulation, or if that comes from some other motivation, it's going to affect what you're actually trying to do when you do your world building. Does that make any sense?
Well, yeah, that makes
Yes.
perfect sense. And what I think the solution is easy. You design your system, then you design your people and say, how are the people fucking it up?
Actually, I'd like to step in for probably a few minutes. um, both issues do actually stem from the same origin. Like, the issue of, like, internal consistency and, like, the whole problem you were having with, like, saying don't start with the geography. Yes and no. Like, you don't want, like, start with just building a world map. That's absurd. It doesn't work. But the way that, like, when I've been teaching a class about world design, what I had suggested is that you start from fundamental aspects and you build upwards from there, because each layer impacts the next layer and provides inspiration for it. So, the first thing I had my students even do before anything else was I had them design the planet and its star, its orbit, and so on. Because things like, if you start out on a world that is 90% ocean, it's going to have a completely different evolutionary path than one that is 90% land. And this kind of stuff, each time you go through it, it gets more and more complex. So I'll use an example from one of the students. She started off with an oceanic planet because she has, like, this addiction to mermaids. Makes sense. But because I made them do something interesting for their orbit, she ended up having a binary of two planets that were orbiting each other around their sun. So what happened was that this immediately had one of the planets ended up with so close of an orbit to the other that it was very prominent in the sky at, like, all times of the day almost. And that changed, like, their religious views. It changed their tides. It changed so many different aspects. And each time that she went on to a new aspect, like creating different species, like start off with, like, plant life that can absorb light from the sun and such. Then you have to create, like, uh, the natural progression evolutionarily is, well, we have food. It's plant life. So something's going to eat the plant life. And then from there you say, okay, we have something that's eating the plant life. Something's going to eat the herbivores. And then you're going to have a bigger thing that eats those. And then eventually you'll get to a point where it's not energy efficient and you'll have scavengers or parasites or diseases and such that will eat predators from the inside out, or they'll eat it after it's already dead. This kind of progression, as you go up in steps one at a time, it changes everything that comes after. So if you have a species that, let's say that it's poisonous, you'll have another species that's immune or resistant to the poison, and then they go in a little arms race against each other. Every time you do something like that, one has, like, say, spikes, the other one gains armor plating so that they're not scared of the spikes. Now they have armor plating, that changes everything past that for, like, their technology. If you have, like, the mermaids, for example, they're not going to be all that interested in developing boats very early on, are they? But in a world like ours, we had to develop boats. if we didn't, we'd be kind of screwed. It was one of the first technologies we learned about. And things like even your economy is going to revolve around what kind of world that you're living within. If you have an enormous amount of food available, then you're not going to worry about developing preserved food because you don't need to. If you're not doing a lot of travel, you're not going to develop a lot of stuff for travel, like not just the technology for a boat or a car or whatever. You're not going to develop like rations that last for a long period of time because you don't need them. So
A simple phrase. Necessity is the mother of invention.
yeah,
Necessity is a
and
mother.
but the point
What'd you say,
is,
Fatherless?
I said necessity is a mother.
Yeah. Yeah.
but the point is that yeah, if you are going to design a world, to a degree, you do actually want to have an idea of what's in that world. You don't need a map at the very start. You really seriously don't. You
Yeah.
don't need to know exactly where the rivers are. You don't need to know where the mountains are. But if you know that there are rivers and there are mountains, and you know that there are, for example, a great deal of food up in the mountains, you know that there's going to be some sort of technology or population that will find a way to live in the mountains.
Yeah.
So,
However, it's also important to keep geography in mind that you can't just have a desert appear suddenly in the middle of nowhere. There has to be a reason why that desert is there.
well,
And
everything's
that is a mistake some people make. You know, it's like, oh, well, they suddenly come to a desert, and it's like, okay, how did that desert form? And it's like, I don't know. And
that's
you have to be a little bit mindful of the structures of the land and how they form. There's probably a very valid reason for that. Will it necessarily make it into your story? Probably not. Or maybe it does. Maybe there's a mountain that created a rain shadow effect. That on one side of the mountain it has a lot of green, but the other side is nothing but desert. So off to the distance you see a mountain.
that's actually a large part of why world design is so complex. Everything is interconnected. You can't learn. Like, you can't learn a single thing and say, I know world design, because you can't. You have to understand geology, you have to understand psychology, religion, all of the things like evolutionary theory. You have to understand how everything goes together, weather patterns, seismic and tectonic stuff, atomic theory, everything. It all works together, like you were describing for just having a desert. You don't just drop a desert in. There's a reason why the desert's there, and if you know why the desert's there, then that builds everything else around it. It's like, okay, I need a desert. Okay, well, what's going to create a desert? Is it going to be because of the rain shadow effect of your mountain, or is it going to be something more because it's a Arctic tundra desert where there's just it's too cold for precipitation?
You
Stuff
guys
like
really make me want to design an RPG that takes place in a single room, a single unlit room.
Well, you know, here's the thing that always bothered me about guides. And this is what started me on my path of creating. Like, I have over 25 articles now on world building. And I'm still continuing. I'm going to be doing this for years. But when I started looking at world building, because I had to answer a question, what kind of structures or what kind of things would you see in a castle? And I couldn't find any information on it whatsoever. I mean, is there a city inside of a castle, or is that outside? And I've since answered that question, so you don't need to tell me. But I realized that all world building guides are like, ask you a list of questions. It's like, what resources does your world have? And it's like, I don't know. What are my options? And I've always found that so limiting, that there was nothing out there that just described what could you have. Like, you know, I did a whole entire article on copper, and I learned so much information about copper that it's anti-corrosive, it's antimicrobial, that you could actually drink, you could pour water in there into copper and it would disinfect the copper. It would disinfect the water. In fact, the ancient Egyptians had a piping system where water flowed through copper and it made it drinkable water. Now, they probably didn't fully understand why this water was so much better, but it is something to consider. So you have copper, you have silver that actually does much of the same things. Or, it's interesting with copper is that it was important in the ancient age, but by the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, no one ever used it. It was rarely used. But once we reach the modern age, it is highly used again. And understanding things like that can really help to determine what metals does your world use, why, and what do they eat? How do they get that? Are there agrarian society? Do they mine? What resources don't they have? Which I think is another important thing, which requires that they trade with other places, or they may decide that if they want something, they'll go and conquer the neighboring nation just to get it.
A bigger question there is what happens when you have a resource they don't have a basic resource, like say oil doesn't exist on their world, period. Then what? That makes a really big difference in how their entire civilization will progress over time. There's also the issue of resources that don't exist. Like, you can study copper inside and out, and you can learn so much about it. What about mithril? What are the properties of mithril? Like, strong as steel, but light as a feather? Okay, what else? Like, what other effects does it have? What if you grafted it into your skin? What if you wore it as a necklace? Does it have, like, any radioactive properties? Like, magical radiation or something? Like, things like that really alter what happens as well. Now, that kind of thought, it's really advanced. Like, you don't normally need to go to that level of detail. But if you do think about things just a little bit further, like saying, okay, this area, we're going to have this tribe, they all like having mithril necklaces. Maybe that affects their birth rate in a positive or a negative way. It doesn't really matter so much which it goes for. What matters is, what is the effect? How does it change what's going on around you? And every time you think about something like that, because it makes a change, the fact that it made a change, that means that you now have more information about your world. You have more information about the people that live in that world. You have more information about what their civilization is like. And every time you do that, it gives you another idea of like, okay, well, if that's the case, then something else is going to change because of it. And then something's going to change because of that. And world building isn't difficult. It builds itself.
I'll give you an example of what I mean. I was talking to someone on the world building Reddit, which I strongly suggest everyone check out because it's a great place to get ideas. But, I just released my article on copper on there. And someone was saying, well, this is really interesting stuff, but I'm trying to design a world without copper, and I'm thinking of maybe using aluminum, and that people had access to aluminum but not to copper, and developed a whole society based on that. And he was doing a medieval-esque world. Well, the thing about aluminum is we didn't really discover it until the 1800s. It's one of the most abundant minerals in the world, or metals in the world, but we didn't discover it until the 1800s, but we didn't know how to properly extract it. And when we first were processing it, it actually had the value of gold because we could only produce so little of it. And it wasn't until the 1900s when we started using electricity to purify it that it became so abundant. Well, if your world, your medieval-esque world, is going to have aluminum as its primary metal for whatever reason, then that also means that your world has either A, developed electricity, or B, has found a different way to extract the metal
You could go
than electricity, which might have an effect on how you extract other metals.
you could go on like this forever. I mean, at a certain point, I still think that you have to
Mike,
start with a thing. Sorry, you could. No, sorry, I'm not used to this. You could do this forever. I think you have to. It sounds to me you really do need to start with what's truly interesting to you, and I think it's important to be mindful what's going to come up and play. And if it's never going to come up and play, is it worth the energy to really worry about like metallurgical properties when it's like, yeah, if the only way it doesn't come up and play, Now you guys make me really want to just like do a role playing game where you role play as like water droplets in a cloud. And that's it. That's the entire game. And the only things I look at are aerodynamics and maybe a little bit to do with wind and like maybe a little bit to do with like the sun and like the few handful of chemicals that like affect water droplets, but mostly that's kind of it,
don't
or
forget
maybe
birds.
yeah, or maybe if I do, or well, maybe if it's stratospheric, really specialized game world, or maybe I want to do like a treasure room RPG where you role play like a magical treasure, like a sword, like you play as a MacGuffin, and your job is to attract heroes to rescue you, and that's it. And as soon as you leave the treasure room, the game's over, and you've won.
Well, here's the
And
thing I'm gonna say is that it doesn't have to be to that excessive of level as like what Mad Cat's describing.
I feel like you
But
guys are like, well, what if like subatomic particles are reverse charged, but gluons remain the same? What would happen?
I've
I'm just
actually
like,
thought about that. Sorry,
I know
but
you have,
the
and I
I
and I
I designed
the
my magic
point.
system based on that kind of level of thinking.
Yeah, like the magic system I worked out replaced electrons with uh, manonetics. So it was like actual mana charge, which worked similar to electricity, and you couldn't have like the carrier particle for uh, electricity and magic at the same time because they were mutually exclusive.
Well, let,
But
let me
the
give you further example of something. And I 100% agree with you, Fatherless. You don't need to go to this kind of level to know
this
every
seems
single element in
neurotic.
order to design your world. However, you do need to do your research. If your character has, for example, in my story, my Dagar legacy that I'm writing about vampires, I wanted the characters to have swords made of silver. But I'm like, they do it in Skyrim, they do it in Oblivion, so it must be a legitimate thing. And so I did some research, and I found
It's
out
too
that would
soft,
actually
right?
be a very bad idea to do
silver
because
inlay.
silver is too soft of the metal that one, it would bend and warp, and two, it wouldn't hold a sharp edge for very long.
Yeah, the best
So
you could do would be like silver leaf on steel or something like that.
actually, one of my characters has a Damascus sword made of a composite of steel and silver.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you don't need to go to that level for the most part. Like you're saying like, oh, you don't need to like figure out all this stuff at this intrinsic level. And it's like, no, you really don't. But broad sweeping concepts like say, are there three moons in the sky instead of one or zero? That does change things. You
Yeah.
don't need to go through like extensive detail. You don't have to say like figure out exactly the mass of every single moon. You don't need to figure that out. It helps, but you
It
don't
has to
need
come up
to.
during
But
play, though.
well,
It has to
it
come up in a meaningful way during
Mike,
play.
I'm
It has to come
gonna
up in a meaningful way during play, and I think you have to have a sense of what's interesting to
yeah.
you or to the people that are going to
That's
be playing.
why
Because
I'm
I guess
saying
because this is
sorry.
because I mean to me this is like a whole other thing, but I mean this is to me is like a neurotic obsession with I'm not trying to insult you, but like this is to me like a neurotic obsession with internal consistency, you know And I feel like there's a point where you have to sort of step back and be like, yep, A, B, and C are not internally consistent. Don't care. It's still fun. You know,
But at the same
story's
time,
still interesting.
just being aware of what's out there, and that's why I'm designing my guide. That's why I'm going through all the trouble of researching this and how it was used and what properties it has to save people the time of having to research it. If they want the information, it's there, which
It's
so
gonna,
far no one else has ever done before.
without doubt, that kind of guide is going to be useful to a lot of people for sure.
But at the end of the day, what's really going to come down is your story interesting to read? And that's the end product right there.
Yeah.
World building is important. It's pre-production stuff. It's probably going to have a lot of stuff that doesn't make it into the final story, but it is going to influence it.
I mean, I think it's cool to start with what is an interesting premise to you and to try to trace things outwards, But at a certain point, it needs to lead you to other interesting places, And when you get back into the more mundane world, because to be honest, there's a part of me that wants to take a Zelda approach to cartography and just be like, yep, I put a desert there because it's a functional wall. And I know that's wrong.
You add
I want to strangle you now.
You don't have.
I know.
You don't have to go into that level of detail by any means, but if you know that your world has no moon, then you know it has no tide, and that even though it's not really that relevant for the most part, it may not show up in gameplay for the most part, it gives you thoughts about what's going to change after that. The more you think about something, the more inspiration you get because it's self-referential. If you add even a little bit of extra thought to something, you're opening up the option for more interesting things to happen, even if the thing that they're based off isn't that interesting itself.
Well, I think the word here that I gravitate to is inspiration. I mean, if you're truly excited about wherever your premise and then secondary questions are, and you just keep going and going, I think that's great as long as you're really pursuing questions that are interesting to you, And I think maybe this conversation, you guys just happen to be more interested in metallurgy than I'll ever be. Or in my case, if you really want me to slit my wrists, let's talk about plants, because when I was a little kid, I could never cross the backyard without my dad stopping to identify every single fucking plant. And to me now, growing up, they're just fucking green shit.
Well, okay.
And the only question is, does it go in a salad or not?
Let me put it in this context.
Green shit that goes in a salad, or it's green shit that I step on, and that's it.
Let me put it to you in this context. World building is important for things to be logically consistent in your world.
Exactly. And how logically consistent should your world be? I mean, the old Alice in Wonderland was not logically consistent at all. It's actually a modern thing. Like the old Frank Baum stories were not. Their world building was not. It was just stuff. It had nothing.
Well, here's the thing: is that you don't need to go to these detailed levels. It's there if you want to, but you can definitely tell a writer who doesn't do any world building at all, who can just say, yes, I have a gold piece and I want a horse, or I want a bowl of soup, or my family got rich from farming, or they go to a city and found the only blacksmith that's there, or just a wide variety of things that it's this doesn't make any logical sense. How can an entire city survive off of one blacksmith? You would have to have several blacksmiths to accommodate what a city is. So it's logical consistency, but the problem is, and this is why me and Kat come from the direction that we do, is that if you're going to design your world, there's a lot of thought that you do have to put into it. How does a city survive? What resources do they have? What government is ruling over them? what are the people like? Are they assholes or are they kind? And how your character walks through that world when they enter into the village. What should they expect to see?
I think that's one approach. I think another approach too is if it's more metaphorical. Like maybe the world you have is itself not particularly internally consistent, and it's not a simulation. It's not meant up to for you to be able to like wind it up and go. But maybe the different parts of it are all little metaphors for things in real life, you know, and uh, and it's they're not really meant to be taken to each other as much as different things. There as all I can say, I guess I just have to keep using the word metaphor over and over again. But
Well,
maybe
and I
just
understand where you're going with that. And if there's
yeah,
a market for that and people want to enjoy that, that's all well and fine. But it's been my experience that other people out there search for things that are wrong so they can point it out. We
yeah.
have a
Well,
whole culture of critics that do exactly that.
It's not even that they search for it. It's like the more accurate something is, the more it stands out when something isn't. It's like if you have an entire white wall and there's one black dot in the middle of it, where's your attention?
Well, and I know, and to be honest, I think that's the kind of fan that makes me hate the world of games and RPGs. And I'm not gonna, and remember, I am not a game designer nor a professional aspiring writer, and I have the license to sort of look, I don't want to say look down on, but just there's this sort of like let's take everything as literally as possible mentality that to me just sucks the fun out of the room, like I'll give you a story. I remember there was this guy I knew, and I was just talking about a combat system I was working on and a fireball, and say it again. Is cat ducking out for a second?
I guess so.
Okay.
Yeah, just for a second. Sorry.
Yeah. So this guy was like, I was just like, for me it was good enough to simply say like the fireball did X damage to all creatures within this area, and that was good enough to me because it served the needs of the system, I wasn't just trying to have like a rules light combat system. But he's like, well, what if you fire the fireball into an area that's smaller than the area of effect of the fireball? Where does that damage go? It's gotta go somewhere. You've got to have blowback, and you've got to have physics, and it's got to go somewhere. What if it goes through a vent? I want my damage, damn it! And I just realized like I'm just never going to be able to communicate with you about games because like the way you think about these things is insane. Like,
Oh,
and
I
yet
agree
I know
there.
well, yet I know yet people do think that way. Like, but I'm just the kind of person who never gave a shit if Han Solo shot first, and like I guess I'm sort of content to not know why things work. Like, the most disappointing thing for me in Star Wars in the so-called prequels was when they explained the Force, you know? And I actually like there being things that we don't know and aren't explained, you
And you
know?
can certainly have that. You can have things that are not explained, and that's all well and fine. But I'll give you two examples of something, of why world building is so important to me. Um, my same writer friend came to me as like discussing possibilities of things, and she's like, "What if there was somewhere in the universe where the laws of physics were not the same as ours?" And I'm like, "That would be impossible. The laws of physics are what they are. Now they might be something that we're not aware of." But they still constitute to the world laws of physics. Like, no, 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 no. This is a place in the universe where what we know to be true about physics is not true here. And I'm like, such a place couldn't exist. Because even if they experienced different things than we did, it would still cater to the laws of physics. Now, we might have to update our laws of physics because we now are seeing a new thing, but they would still correspond to the laws of physics. That
Yeah.
in a gravity well, you drop a ball, it's going to drop in proportion to its gravity. Now, let me give you a second thing about why world building is so important to me. Is that Star Wars. Star Wars has some of the worst world building elements. I mean, you put handcuffs on a Jedi. Don't you think you might want to build something that can hinder a Jedi's ability to use the Force? It's like you don't even want to arrest them. But the part that really pissed me off with Star Wars from a young age was the first movie. You have, and I love telling this, you have a Wookiee has a gun. You have a scoundrel with a gun. You have a farm boy who's never really seen combat before with a gun and a princess. They come upon four stormtroopers, four soldiers in armor, all of them with guns. They have the distinct advantage in that situation. And what do? They turn away, they turn and run away. That would not happen. Now, the excuse, I'm given so many excuses for this. It's like, oh, well, they were really stupid, or they were running to go get to the other men. And it's like, no, they turned and left themselves vulnerable to be shot in the back. They wouldn't have done that. They would have raised their guns and put themselves in a defensive position. And yet, I mean, it was done for a comedic effect, and I understand that, but it's just like, that wouldn't happen. And in fact, Spaceballs actually got that correct. They stayed and shot instead of running away. A parody got it right. And
Well, that
that's
actually
when I
makes-
start having a problem. It's like, you're not doing something to make the story serious, you're just doing it for comedic effect, and that's where I start to lose respect. You want me to take it serious, but then you do stupid bullshit like that.
Oh yeah, I'll be right back in a minute. If you guys are still on this topic, I'll add my 2 cents.
So that's why it's hard for me to take Star Wars seriously, and I tend not to like Star Wars. There's just a lot of stupid elements in there like that that make no logical sense. Actually, I'm quite certain you can put links into chats.
Yeah, not if it's to YouTube though. I'd have to like split the link up and then it starts getting weird.
Yeah, you can put a link in there.
Well, it didn't let me earlier. What the
I just
hell?
put one in there.
What the fuck? Okay, give me a second.
Let me try it with a link outside of YouTube. Yeah, you can't click on it, but oh, I guess you can. Interesting. Yeah, you can put a link in there. Well, I think we're coming to the end. I'll wait for Fatherless to come back if he wants to respond to my comment, but you know, we've given a good hour on this. Actually, we've given 90 minutes on this. Yeah, we should probably stop soon. As you can tell, we love talking about this stuff.
Well, it's fun and it's interesting and kind of useful. 1 second.
I think so. And I love designing worlds, but you know, I'll tell you the part that I hate about writing is the part that I'm at right now, where I'm just like going through my book over and over and over again, trying to find every single mistake that I've made, and it's just like, I'm sick of my story. I want to burn it right now.
The heck? Okay. I go
And
to
I'll
send
still
it. It
finish
says
it.
message
I'll still
not
publish
sent.
it.
Oops. Remove any web addresses and try again.
So can I speak to that bit about the firefight in Star Wars?
Yeah.
Okay. I have to tell you a related story about Pirates of the Caribbean. I'm just gonna come out and say, and it won't surprise you, that those kinds of inconsistencies just have never bothered me and never will bother me. And I'm just a different kind of fan. And I'm much more interested in myth and metaphor than I am in realism or internal consistency. And I think that that the internal consistency thing is like a very strange and neurotic fetish, but it seems to be one. It's like I've already lost this battle. I'm just sort of watching this play out, and a lot of this has to do with why we have so many sequels to movies, but that's neither here nor there. Let me tell you my story. Pirates of the Caribbean, okay? I remember, think it
That's
was
not
made
your
in,
story.
okay, I'm going to tell my story about seeing it. So I went with like 5 or 6 guys, and I remember we went there and we watched a sword fight, and I think there was a wheel, and like Jack Sparrow was fighting a skeleton, and they were like on a wheel having a sword fight, um, something like that, you know. And it was a sword fight, and that's what it was. So when the movie was over, we were leaving, and there one of the kids we were with, and he was like a friend of a friend. He was this little nerdy kid, and he was so mad, and he was pissed, like he was visibly angry that the sword fighting wasn't realistic, and it wasn't realistic to him on the basis that like it was like the actual moves that they used in the sword fight had nothing to do with what like they would do in real combat, you know. And all I could say was like, uh-huh, and because it was like, first of all, they were fighting on wheels that were moving, and they were fighting a skeleton, and none of this is realistic. And Jack Sparrow is raised from the dead kind of sort of character, but we don't know that yet, and that's unrealistic. And yep, most of the moves they make have nothing to do with what actual fencing would be like, and they're doing unrealistic backflips, and it was actually just kind of made to look cool. It wasn't actually. And what got to me is that he thought he was looking at a sword fight. It wasn't. It was sword dancing. I mean, the whole thing was a dance routine. Um, he just couldn't quite accept that, and it was like this had nothing to do with a simulation of a sword fight against a skeleton on a wheel. It had and everything to do with just flashy body language and swords and making things kind of look cool and awesome, and it really had nothing to do with realism or internal consistency, and it wasn't the point, and he just couldn't accept that. And I realized, like, there's no words that I have. I have no tools. I have nothing to say, well, that's to ever, like, convince the guy that the sword fighting was, its lack of realism was irrelevant. But there's
Well,
just a lot of people that think that way.
and you know what? I
Well,
never
it's
had a
called the little
problem with
cool.
that scene. I never had a problem with them fighting on a wheel. Yeah, it's inconsistent and probably couldn't happen, but I didn't care about that. I mean, another thing in Star Wars that I hated was the Phantom Menace when Qui-Gon Jinn and Darth Maul basically walk down a hallway with force fields, and which doesn't really seem to serve any real purpose, but okay, and they make it all the way near the end. And then when it opens up again, Obi-Wan Kenobi runs down that hallway but still can't make it there by the end. And he was going much faster than them. He should have been able to go. It was a plot convenience. And I think
And
that's
more than
where
that,
I
it's
start having
irrelevant.
problems is it's a plot convenience thing that doesn't make sense.
And
Your
it's really
example
blatantly obvious.
it wasn't a plot convenience so much as this is just what naturally progressed. That's why I don't have a problem with them fighting on the wheel. They started fighting, and this happened.
I guess, but I mean, they could have made anything happen. They did a fight. They did the fight on the wheel, not because it naturally progressed, but because they thought a fight on a wheel would look cool,
And they
and
were
be
right.
kind of flashy, and would make the characters look kind of fun. I guess just that level of like consistency has never interested me. Then again, as far as I'm concerned, Prometheus is the worst movie ever made for this.
I have
I was
And
warned about that before I saw it, and I watched it, and I was like, I was prepared for this, but I was not. I did not
well,
realize it could be so
well,
dumb.
well, here's the thing. This is kind of my thing. This is I guess my thesis. Anything except for the actual world we live in now is impossible, because if it was possible, it would exist. So anything that you do that's going to be alternative or speculative is going to be inconsistent somewhere. It's just a matter of knowing where the wrinkles are.
Well,
That's
it's
my
the willing
initial.
suspension of disbelief. It's how
Yeah,
far you're willing
but the thing
to
is
put
like
up with.
Yeah,
something.
and it's like you can try to minimize it, but I feel that when you have a fan base and a movie-going public that just obsesses over internal consistency, you end up with the only movies that you can really make are movies like Prometheus, because they have to know why things happen, and their sense of why is not really why in the metaphorical sense. It's why. It's really they're asking how. And they want to know, like, well, what makes an alien? Well, if the guy drinks the black liquid and then the baby comes out and then the baby gets eaten by the other alien and then the alien shits out an egg and then the egg gets mashed into a white liquid and then they mix the white liquid with the black liquid and then the black liquid becomes an egg and then they eat the egg and then the egg becomes a face sucker, and you're like, who cares? Who fucking cares about the life cycle of this idiotic fucking alien? The whole point of the original Alien movie was that it was one ship, one alien, and they just can't explain it. And what makes things exciting is what you can't explain, and and what's left unsaid is always more powerful than whatever shitty explanation you come up with.
That's true,
And
except for plot convenience.
uh, and it
Because
just
that's the biggest slap in the face to anyone. That the reason why something happened is it had to be convenient
It
for
was
the
in the
plot.
script.
It
It's
was
like,
in the
why did you
script.
do that? It was in the script.
Oh, this door suddenly shut and we can't get it open, even though earlier in the day I got it open just fine. But now I can't get it open, so that character on the other side of the door has to die. Why couldn't he do something that he did before?
I guess
Because
I
the
can.
plot requires it to
If
happen
you
that
mentioned
way.
it before, though, that's like something where you're just like, okay, well, earlier in the case they showed them with the door. Well, earlier in the movies showed them with the door actually sticking a little bit. Say, oh yeah, there's a trick to it.
I
You
know.
have
You
to
know what?
do this.
I guess I'm just a weird because this technique of establishing things so that they make sense later. Like, just I don't care because to me the reason the character dies is not because the door's stuck, but because in this particular formula, it's 2/3 of the way through the movie and it's time for someone to die. I already know that.
And I could accept that, but it has to be a legitimate reason. It can't just be we need this character to die and it's could have been prevented, or the writers are lazy and it's like, let's just kill this character to make the story more interesting. No, there has to be, and that's where we're going to differ. And I think that's probably where we're going to need to end this, is that people go to movies for different reasons. People
Well, I mean,
have a different reaction for
I
different
seem to be
movies.
the only person that thinks this way,
Really?
but
Because I've always felt alone in how I thought about movies.
I feel that I'm not going to take a side on. I've
Stop talking
most of
about
the
your
times that
feels.
like the um I guess I just care more about metaphor and the way they're working with like kind of known sort of like plot formulas and stuff, and the way they're sort of retelling like old stories, like for me like um and I guess I mean the plot convenience is something worth thinking about for sure. Um, but I guess I just view movies from an almost entirely symbolic level anyway, and I think I don't even like think about the world as being a consistent place because I already know it's fake. Um, I just my brain doesn't go there.
And that's fair.
Yeah, I mean it's like really just a totally different kind of thinking. Like it gets into like the whole mythos versus logos thing.
Well,
Um,
I'd say it's just an issue that there's the whole non sequitur thing, where it's like, I open the door and the window explodes. It's like, why? To some degree, there has to be at least some sort of tangential, like, vague relation between the two events. Like, if it's going to happen, why is it happening? Unless you're playing it specifically for its sheer absurdity in a comedy, you just you have to have some consistency between why anything happens. Like, it doesn't have to be super accurate consistency, as long as you have an explanation that's like, that's iffy, but I'll,
Well,
I'll let it slide because at least you had an explanation. It didn't have to be a good one, it just had to be there.
Well, I'll give you an example of something that really bothered me at first until I really realized what was going on. I was watching The Lone Ranger with Johnny Depp, and there's a scene where Tonto is in prison, and then the next moment, the next scene, he's watching over a canyon. And a lot of people complained about this until I realized why this actually makes sense. It's because we have an unreliable narrator. At the beginning of the movie, Tonto is an old man. He's like in his hundreds or something. And it's like, well, his mind is probably going to be warped, so he's not remembering things the correct way. So that's why I can accept a lot of the inconsistencies in the film, because our narrator is highly unreliable.
Interesting. It's very interesting.
The point
But
is,
I think
though,
we're going
it
to
does
go ahead
really
and end it here,
Okay.
because we've been going on for 90 minutes, and I think we could talk another 5 hours on this, but I don't want to torture our fans like that. So is there anything
Well, they
final
wouldn't
you
be our
guys want
fans
to say
anymore.
about anything we've discussed? Kat,
Um,
anything final?
Mostly, well, there's a lot of things. I think the easiest would be just to say that I do a lot of videos on this kind of stuff already, so if you want to see like more of this kind of stuff, then it'd be awesome if we could do more of these hangouts. But otherwise, go to zayorsa.info, and that'll give you at least my side of things. So.
And Fatherless, anything final you want to say?
No, but I think your icon's really badass.
Mine is?
It looks really strong. I don't give a shit
Well,
about
except
the
for
motors,
the fact
but it
that
looks
the
really
missile
badass.
racks are damaged. There's like only half of a missile rack there.
Well, it's not that half the missiles are firing, it's that the first half already fired.
Oh, so you had an internal ammo explosion because it jammed.
Well, I think the final thing I want to say on this is that, story, characters, world building, they're all so intertwined with each other, which is definitely what Kat was saying. But, at the end, what's really going to matter is how good your story is.
Yeah.
You can have a good story with bad world building, and you can have great world building and a bad story. And what are people going to remember is whether or not the story was good or not.
The world building just makes it easier to have a good story is all. It doesn't guarantee it.
And
Well, that would be an interesting question for another day. Would be, what do you focus on during world building to carry over to your story later on, and what are the parts that are less important? But that's like a whole other thing.
So, anyways, for my final statement, if you want to go to that level of detail, you can, but just realize that your reader may not necessarily want that level of detail when they're reading it. So be sure that you try to balance out what is important to you and what's important for the story. So that will be my final statement.
Don't turn into Tolkien.
Yeah, Tolkien was awful. But anyways...
What was wrong with Tolkien?
Like 4 pages describing like the inside of an inn that never gets mentioned again and has no relevance to the story kind of thing. Like, it's really, you get obsessive about the world building. Like, it's okay that you have this information, it's just not relevant. Please don't tell me 50 pages of crap that has nothing to do with what's going on.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I mean, that makes me think of Robert Jordan with the 3-paragraph description of lentil soup.
That makes me think of Stephen King. I went through all 7 of those fucking Dark Tower novels, and the last 100 pages of the entire series was on the Dark Tower. And Stephen King has the balls. It's like, well, if you only cared about the Dark Tower, then you should have just skipped to the end. And it's like, it was 10 years between your 3rd novel and your 4th novel when you wrote it. Anyways, that's another discussion for another time.
Thing, yeah.
All right. Take care, everyone.